Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the program tonight, our top focus, Galwan decoded. Did China hide its Galwan casualties? China lost perhaps 42 soldiers in the June 2020 clash in eastern Ladakh. That's at least 9 to 10 times more than the 4 it has acknowledged. The actual number is more. It's about 42 inclusive of those they have acknowledged. Now, today's program is on the basis of a report quoted by the Australian investigative site, the Klaxon. Now, they've come out with an investigative piece by Anthony Clan, the editor of the Klaxon, who joins us on this program in just a little while. Now, he's based his work on a report prepared by a group of social media researchers who've been able to unearth a sustained effort by Chinese officials to bury the truth on what really happened in Galwan Valley. That's first up on the program, but up after that, will the new Omicron subvariant mean another COVID wave? While most global cases are still the original Omicron virus, the World Health Organization says most countries, including India, are primarily going to be seeing the BA2 subvariant. I'll be joined by the World Health Organization's chief scientist, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. But first, remember, India lost 20 soldiers in Galwan. The number was officially acknowledged. In India, that's still very much the case. But there have always been questions on whether the casualty count announced by China of 4 killed in action was at all accurate. According to the Klaxon and their editor, whose interview you'll see in just a few moments, it was not. But before we get to that, as you can imagine, lots of comments coming in. China has the old habit to hide a real picture from the world and then politicize the matter, is what one of the views are. Samir Thakur writes and says, China has the old habit to politicize the matter. Devraj says, has China ever disclosed anything that affects its image in the international community? Joining us now, Anthony Clan. Thanks, Anthony, very much for being with us. You know, lots of interesting bits in your article, the first of two. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of quotes and then let's talk about it. First up, the article says, evidence provided by a group of social media researchers, which the Klaxon has independently built on, appears to support claims that China's casualties extended well beyond the 4 soldiers named by Beijing. What exactly have these social media researchers unearthed?
So the social media researchers have been working for about a year on this. They've uncovered quite a number of points. The key point being there were many more Chinese soldier deaths than has been reported or claimed by China. Of course, as you mentioned before, there are a couple of other points also. There were, in fact, 2 clashes. There have been Chinese media reports that have conflated the two. There was one altercation that occurred, this is on June 6, 2020, yep. And then there was the June 15 altercation in which we saw the casualties, the many casualties. So at the nub of it, there was the battle or the confrontation, the deadly confrontation came about regarding a temporary bridge that Indian soldiers had erected over a stream of the Galwan Valley in order to allow them to pass to inspect Chinese installations in the buffer zone. So there's a buffer zone. The agreement was that neither party would install infrastructure in the buffer zone. So what's occurred is India's built this temporary bridge to inspect what China's doing in the region or doing in the buffer zone. Now, China's allegedly building infrastructure, putting up tents, building dugouts, and having large machinery in the area. So the confrontation on June 6th involved several hundred soldiers. There was no deaths. It was more of a confrontation than a major scuffle. But officers of each side of the debate made an agreement, or allegedly made an agreement, in order to fuse the situation. So infrastructure of each side would be removed. Now, what's happened that we've managed to ascertain, and it's been backed up by numerous sources, is that in the interim, rather than removing its infrastructure, Chinese forces have removed this temporary bridge that India was using in order to inspect. And this has led to the June 15 conflict. So India's come across to discuss this, or to meet with Chinese soldiers and Chinese officers.
Yes.
And this is when the scuffle's broken out. And so that particular evening, when we've got soldiers that have come across, there was a battle. Several soldiers were killed, and in heading back across the river, this is when we're told, the evidence is that numerous or many Chinese soldiers were in fact washed away. Now, we're talking about the Galwan River at sub-zero temperatures. It's pitch black at night, and there's boulders, etc. at the bottom. So this is how many of the Chinese casualties came to occur.
And we know this on the basis of what was posted on Chinese social media, which was then censored, right?
Yeah, so there's a number of sources. There's conversations with people on the ground. Right. There's Chinese media sources. Now, of particular weight is contemporaneous reports at the time of what's actually occurred. And this has sort of gone through in quite a considerable detail regarding the soldiers washed away. Adding weight to that is the fact that you have China that's gone out of its way to censor particularly any information regarding casualties from the Galwan battle that evening, the Chinese side casualties. And that extends to, as we know, China came out, it said nothing for the first 8 months regarding its casualties. And then on February the 19th, it announced there were 4 deaths. Each soldier had been posthumously awarded a bravery medal. The following day, Chinese authorities announced that a prominent journalist in China had been arrested or had been sacked from his job for stating that the 4 deaths wasn't correct. In fact, it was much, much higher. So that's sending out a signal for people, for others to...
Sure. So, Anthony, let me ask you this. The evidence now of approximately 38 odd Chinese soldiers having been washed away is based on conversations as well, which is what takes the entire story forward in a sense. Your conversations with your sources, deemed credible sources, and of course what you've discussed or described as the efforts made by China to sort of curtail the truth coming out. And therefore you've added one and one together, and you're absolutely sure that there were 38 Chinese soldiers who went down the Galwan River and died.
We know that it's substantially more than 4 deaths. The precise figure we keep coming back to is this 38 figure. There have been higher figures put out in Indian media, up to 100 or something. One report put it higher than 100. Now, we haven't been able to confirm that. We're not saying that's not true. We can't confirm that. But the
38 is based on your conversations, am I right?
The 38, yes. The 38 is based on our research from a number of sources, including the social media investigations and conversations with people on the ground, yes.
Now, the next quote from your article, it also shows extreme lengths Beijing has gone in order to silence discussion about the battle, in particular discussion about the true number of Chinese casualties. So how did it actually happen? On Weibo, Chinese social media, their version of Twitter, there was a lot of conversation, right? And there were first-person accounts as well, some of them from soldiers, or apparently from soldiers, who actually witnessed a lot of this happening. And then that was taken down.
That's correct. And of course, the fact that was taken down and with such haste, we've managed to obtain recorded records of this source data, but that it was taken down so quickly gives us another strong indication of that China's very, very eager to have this hushed up, or to not have any more debate or discussion regarding the casualties. Another interesting point is that Chinese state media has barely touched this at all. It hasn't reported on the clash in any great detail, and there's been maybe 1 or 2 minuscule reports. So China doesn't want this information coming out. Now, one of the theories is that the Chinese officer that allegedly was quite aggressive, the Indian side says that, look, they went across and discussed this with the Chinese soldiers and with the Chinese officer, and then the Chinese officer allegedly ran quite an aggressive charge and formed a battle line. So whether that officer had authority to do that remains in question. So it may be that officer did not. Yeah.
The next quote, the research report, which you've referred to in your own report, cites a year-long investigation involving discussions with mainland Chinese bloggers, information obtained from mainland-based Chinese citizens, and media reports that have since been deleted by Chinese authorities. In other words, in addition to your own effort at unearthing the truth, there has been an effort in China at compiling the truth as well, based on conversations that these researchers on social media have themselves had, right? And obviously, it's doing that is not easy in China.
No, of course, and that sort of comes back to the main point, is sort of piecing together what's actually happened. Given you've got the threats against people speaking out,
exactly,
that China's very clear that it doesn't want people that it's arrested the journalist. It's making it very clear that it doesn't want this information out. But on the other side, you have families whose loved ones have been killed serving their country, who are no doubt quite concerned or upset that they're not being recognised. The deceased loved ones aren't being recognised. So there's that pressure. Now, there's a line of thought that this is why China's come out 8 months after the fact. Now, it actually said it wasn't going to reveal casualties. It's its policy not to, but then it came out in February and did, February 2020, that is.
Sure.
So the query is perhaps, or the thought is that there's increasing pressure on China regarding this incident, and perhaps it thought that might take some pressure out of it.
Many Chinese soldiers, you write, were killed while attempting to cross back over the fast-flowing Galwan River in the early stages of June 15th and 16th battle. What is this based on? Is this, because this is the critical bit, what is this based on? Is it based on conversations that you have had, or stuff which you have seen which has been deleted from Chinese social media, first-hand accounts? What exactly?
Yeah, so it's first-hand accounts that's been deleted from Chinese social media. One count in particular involves a first-hand account of someone who attended a funeral of one of the people that died. Now, it's worth remembering that only one of the 4 soldiers that China has admitted died in the battle was drowned. So there's a report particularly regarding this incident, and this soldier has pushed at least four other people across the river and then become stuck in the river. And this is when many other people also were swept away.
All right, let's just bring up some satellite imagery of the area that we are actually talking about so that I can just explain this to our viewers and then come back to this conversation. What you're actually seeing is that bend of the Galwan River, and this is a little bit further afield. But this is where the Chinese built up their construction after the clashes actually took place. These are areas where the Chinese were trying to construct a road. This is where they've built up further afield some of their tents, their storage huts, and their huts for their soldiers, tents for their soldiers. And it was in this area across the fast-flowing river, within about 300 meters of this area that you're actually seeing on your screen, where the fighting actually took place. These are images that we procured from Maxer and from Planet Labs. And this is, let's have this up full screen. This is the exact location, in fact, in Ladakh where this took place. So on the left-hand side is actually is a river which then leads into the Blue River, which is the Galwan River itself. The site of the clash is near a Y bend of the river, very close to the line of actual control. So this is where it actually took place. I'll just come back to the next quote from your article. Again, quoting that research report, which said that comrades in arms kept slipping and being rushed downstream. The one question I have about this is, if they were in the water and it's a fast-flowing river, then how come none of these bodies actually ended up on the Indian side?
Well, this is the thing. Now, we know the following day of the battle there was a ceasefire and there was a truce for each side to collect their wounded or their fallen. And we have actually information, we haven't been able to confirm that yet, but we have from a couple of sources that there were actually retrievals occurring on the Indian side, because that's the way the river flows the following day, involving helicopters. But we haven't been able to firm that up with the Indian military. So, but that would be consistent with the flow of the river. Yes, we've considered that.
The next quote, according to a Weibo user, Elias Kiang, who claims to have served in the area, the PLA was creating infrastructure in this buffer zone, violating the mutual agreement, and had been trying to expand its patrolling limits within the buffer zone since April 2020. You've spoken about this. But I think it's interesting that there were actually soldiers, and this has been reported in the past as well, who actually got on to social media in China and started talking about what exactly was happening. So these were first-hand accounts, and these were the ones these accounts which were pulled down, because they could have caused a great deal of damage if they haven't already.
Indeed, indeed, and I believe it makes sense. The follow-on logic from that makes sense. That's why China, the following day, immediately on February 20, came out and announced that the prominent Chinese journalist had lost their job, and it was elsewhere reported that he'd been arrested by Chinese authorities. So they made quite a deal of this, and they were obviously quite concerned about that and it coming out at the time. The report of the Chinese reporter was quite direct and forceful in saying what had occurred. So yes, the numerous factors, but particularly this focus on quietening down any discussion of the casualties, and the Chinese government made a point of stating that particularly goes to very much supports what we've also uncovered elsewhere.
A final quote. Let's bring up quote 8 actually. Again quoting that research report. After the incident, the bodies of the soldiers were first taken to Shikwanhe Martyr Cemetery, followed by local ceremonies at local towns of the killed soldiers. In other words, these soldiers were in fact honored. They were honored by the military, and their mortal remains were returned to their relative villages. And that conspiracy of silence was enforced at all of these levels, right?
It's unclear as to how many of these soldiers were returned and how many of these funerals there were. We know there were definitely the 4, and there may have been some others, but the line of thought is that there also were a number that weren't actually returned and weren't acknowledged officially.
Right. And a final question to you. You've got more coming up on this story, right?
Yes, we have another story coming up on Saturday with some extra information that's come forward. So we'll be running that on Saturday.
All right, Anthony, great speaking to you. Thank you very much for joining us with that big exclusive on, as I mentioned, a conspiracy of silence. How many soldiers from China actually died? Were the claims, the official claims made by the Chinese government accurate? It now appears on the basis of this research that that may not have been the case at all. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, one of the big concerns about Omicron now, just when you thought that Omicron was going away from the world, certainly going away from large parts of India, is news of a new sub-variant of Omicron. What exactly does this mean? Is it a very major threat? Joining us now, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization. Thanks, ma'am, very much for being with us. As usual, lots of questions which people have. And so therefore, let me ask you, first up, will the new Omicron subvariant mean another COVID wave?
Hello, Vishnu. Nice to talk to you again. And yes, about this new subvariant, if you remember, when we had the Delta variant classified as variant of concern, we also had several sub-lineages, and people were calling them different names at that time, Delta plus and so on. So whenever there is the virus evolves, and it develops mutations, and it's different enough to be, form a separate lineage, like the Omicron, which is a very different lineage. The viruses continue to keep evolving, and so within Omicron, you do see patterns, different patterns. And from the beginning, we had recognized that the Omicron variant had BA1, BA2, and BA3, and BA1 was predominant at the beginning and still continues to be globally predominant. And BA3, there's very little. But BA2, BA 1.2, which is what we're talking about now, the subvariant is increasing in some countries. There are about 30 countries that are reporting increasing rates, and particularly India and Denmark, but also the UK and South Africa. BA2 seems to be actually getting an edge over BA1 and almost replacing BA1. It is different in terms of some of the mutations that it has, and it does seem to have a slight growth advantage, because in order to replace something, the new variant needs to have a slight growth advantage. And so it's been estimated that it has a 50 or 100% growth advantage over the BA1.
Right.
But in terms of clinical severity,
because it links, what you're saying links into my next question. Is the new Omicron subvariant therefore more dangerous?
So when we call something more dangerous or less dangerous, let's try to see what exactly are we talking about. One aspect, of course, is transmissibility, that we are concerned if something is very transmissible, like Omicron, then it spreads very quickly through the population. Now, the other aspect is clinical severity. Does it cause more severe disease? And luckily, in the case of Omicron, analyzing data from many countries, now it appears that Omicron causes less severe disease in the majority of people, and it has resulted in fewer hospitalizations, fewer critical care beds being occupied, and in fewer deaths. And there's a very extensive analysis in South Africa comparing their Delta wave and Omicron wave, which shows that the case fatality rate of hospitalized patients is about half during the Omicron wave. Now, so that's the other aspect. And the third aspect we're interested in is it able to evade our immune responses that we have thanks to our vaccines or thanks to previous infection? So I think what we know about BA2 is that it does seem to have an advantage in terms of improved transmissibility. That's why it seems to be replacing the BA1, but it doesn't seem to, so far, cause more severe disease or have any other major differences in properties. The one change, of course, is that it doesn't have that mutation that enabled BA1 to be picked up on regular PCR, the S gene target failure. It doesn't have that, and therefore S gene target failure can no longer be used as a proxy for the Omicron variant once it's moved to the BA2 variant, subvariant.
Ma'am, this is a really important point. Are you basically suggesting that it's a lot more difficult to sample BA2, this new subvariant?
The only way is through sequencing. We no longer have a surrogate that we had with the BA1, which could be picked up on regular PCR.
Right. Can you be infected with the Omicron subvariant after being infected by Omicron?
That's a very good question, and that's something that we need to be looking at. We are closely looking at the data on reinfections. I think it's too early really to say, and it's probably unlikely that would be happening to a large extent. Both of them, of course, have the properties of immune evasion, so they are able to reinfect previously infected or vaccinated people much more than previous variants could. But between BA1 and BA2, I don't think we see any significant, we cannot comment on the capacity to reinfect at this point.
Are you seeing, ma'am, reinfections in Omicron cases at all, or are the antibodies which people get on the basis of having been infected with Omicron, does it sustain for some period of time?
So from past experience, we know that the antibodies that you develop will sustain for a period of time, in fact, up to a year or so. And the fact is many people have also received vaccines either before or after they've been infected. So what we call hybrid immunity is considered to be the strongest type of immunity, should be longer lasting as well. It's too short a time. As you remember, Vishnu, we only labeled Omicron as a variant of concern on November 26th of 2021. So it's just been over 2 months, probably too early to have a lot of data on reinfection and in fact on long-lasting immunity. There is some data suggesting that people who've recovered from Omicron, if you take their blood, then it's able to neutralize previous variants, including Delta.
Right.
Which is good, but we don't know whether the same will be true for future variants.
Right.
And that's why we still need to be cautious and continue surveillance, continue monitoring, and continue to be prepared to deal with newer variants that are quite likely to come up, frankly.
In fact, we'll talk about that. But first, the vaccines, do they work against the Omicron subvariant?
I think we need to be very clear on that, because there's some confusion about this. Now, what the early studies showed, which were all lab-based studies, neutralizing antibody levels, showed that the Omicron variant was much less able to be neutralized by antibodies compared to the Delta, and Delta was already less compared to the original strain. This created, of course, a huge amount of concern. However, what is really important is the clinical studies, the clinical effectiveness studies, where you see how many people are getting infected, how many are getting hospitalized, and how many are dying. And when you look at that, then it turns out that the vaccines that we're using are still very good at protecting people against getting severe disease. And I think we're beginning to understand why, and that's because it's not only antibodies that are important in your immune system. We have a whole other part of the immune system, the T cell responses, the cell-mediated immunity, which plays a very important role in preventing you from getting sick. So the good news is that the vaccines are working very well. In fact, almost all the vaccines that have been approved by WHO continue to work well. Where they fall a bit short is in preventing infection. And as you know, we've seen a large number of breakthrough infections in people who have been vaccinated, and even those who've received a booster. Yeah. But most of the time, those infections pass off as being mild. And this is particularly true for the elderly, the most vulnerable. Sure. They have been well protected now by vaccines. And that really gives us a lot of hope that our vaccines are going to be protective. But we still need to develop better vaccines, more broadly protective, looking ahead again, sure, to see if we can protect against all coronaviruses. But right now, I think there's no need to be concerned about the existing vaccines.
Is it likely that COVID will keep mutating?
Yes, absolutely. And we've known that from the beginning. And we've said from the beginning it will keep mutating. It's a property of viruses, RNA viruses, to mutate.
Will there ever be a vaccine that can handle multiple mutations? In other words, sort of the magic vaccine, one that effectively kills off COVID in all its avatars, or deals with it, or protects us from infection in the first place?
That's the holy grail. And in fact, people who've been working on influenza vaccines have also been searching for universal influenza vaccine. As you know, the flu vaccines get modified every year based on circulating strains. Ideally, you'd like a flu vaccine that protects for long and protects against all variants. Similarly, what we call a pan-coronavirus vaccine or a pan-sarbecovirus vaccine, that's what would be very good to have. There's a huge amount of R&D going on this topic. In fact, the WHO had a big convening last week where we brought together all the world scientists to discuss a path to develop a pan-coronavirus vaccine. In the intermediate stage, we could adopt strategies like heterologous, like mix and match. There are intranasal vaccines that are being developed, which might serve well to have local immunity, mucosal immunity. So there are multiple approaches, but I think that scientifically it's very plausible and possible to develop a pan-coronavirus vaccine which will protect, very broadly, and that would be ideal.
All right, ma'am, lovely speaking to you. Thank you so much for taking those questions, on this new subvariant. We just have to be careful, don't we, and keep masking up. Thank you, ma'am, very much for being with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.